Welcome back to Class Act Updates in Education Law. I'm Miriam.
I'm Lisa.
We are attorneys at Walter Haverfield in Cleveland, Ohio. And every few weeks we get together, we talk about the latest legal developments in education law, legal developments that affect school board members, school administrators, teachers, just really anybody who works in the districts with its students.
Today we're going to dive into some issues regarding behavior management, looking at functional behavior assessments and behavior plans and when districts need to be conducting those and implementing them, and some common questions that we get in those areas. And today we also have John Moenk, one of our law clerks who is a third-year law student, joining us. John also has worked in special education and as an administrator in the past, so he'll be giving us some of that insight in our discussions as well. Welcome back.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me again.
Excellent. So as we previously discussed, I think we touched upon discipline fairly early on in our podcast series. I think it was in season 1, maybe episodes 13, 14, and 15. We talked about discipline of general education students, and we talked a little bit about special education students as well. Just to give some background to our audience, all students are entitled to due process, and that means when a child is going to be suspended or expelled, will be missing significant amount of school, some amount of school, that child is entitled to due process, and that typically refers to a notice and a chance to respond to the allegations, and there are quite a few legal protections that student is entitled to. That applies to students who have special education needs and also students who do not. But today's podcast episode will talk about additional protections that special education students are entitled to. So in past episodes, we've discussed discipline for special education students and general education students. And as you know, all students are entitled to due process. We discussed these in season 1, episodes 13, 14, and 15. If you want more detail on due process and manifestation determinations, I recommend that you review those episodes in season 1. Today we'll be talking more about behavior assessments and intervention plans.
Absolutely. And today we're really going to focus on students with disabilities who are eligible under the IDEA. So we are going to make a little bit of a distinction. Everything we talk about today does not necessarily correlate for students under Section 504. So do know that kind of just as a caveat as we move forward.
So as we get into a functional behavioral assessment, when is one required? When is an FBA required?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So as Miriam mentioned earlier, students with disabilities do get their general due process protections, but they also have a right to other special ed protections, including a manifestation determination. So if a child with a disability has been removed from the typical environment for more than 10 days, and there's nuances to how you calculate that, and you can go back and listen to episodes about those pieces as well. But you've gone through that process, the team's met, the team's done manifestation determination and has determined that the conduct that the discipline is stemming from is a result of that child's disability, is because of that disability, it's then determined to be a manifestation. And that is going to mean that the team needs to conduct a functional behavior assessment, if there isn't one already, and develop an appropriate behavior intervention plan. However, if they've already conducted a functional behavior assessment, they're at least going to have to look at the current behavior plan and see if they need to update that, if there's anything they need to adjust or anything they need to look at additionally to what's covered in there.
So I just want to kind of clarify maybe and summarize what I hear you saying. So after a student has been disciplined, if the child has an IEP or has special education needs under the IDEA, the team has to meet and determine whether the behavior leading to the discipline was a manifestation of the child's disability. And if it was, then the district is limited in the kinds of discipline that it can mete out. But in addition, separately from the discipline discussion, in addition, the IEP team is charged with figuring out how to improve that child's behavior, and that makes sense because we don't want students just to continue acting out, even if it's because of their disability. We as a society, we want that child to be able to function in the classroom. So the IEP team, separate from making disciplinary decisions or weighing in on whether the child can go back to the regular classroom or not, separate from that, the IEP team has an important job, and that's to figure out how does this child make progress in behavior from here on going forward? And I think that's where the functional behavior assessment comes in. A functional behavior assessment essentially is an observation, right? Is an observation conducted by a behavior specialist who looks to see what is the purpose of that behavior. Why is this child hitting or kicking or yelling or acting out in other ways? What is the purpose of that behavior, and how can we substitute positive behaviors that we want to see for those negative behaviors?
Right, exactly. And keep in mind too, as we talk about this is when they're required. There's other times that absolutely the team should be talking about them in developing functional behavior assessments or a behavior intervention plan as a result. I mean, certainly students who are not identified under IDEA can still have an FBA and a BIP.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't necessarily wait for the child to be suspended or expelled. If you're seeing challenges in the classroom, be proactive. Be proactive. Invite a behavior specialist to talk to the parents and get consent to do a functional behavior assessment and see what's going on. That person, the behavior specialist, could be somebody that already works in your district and has experience in conducting these kind of assessments, or it could be a consultant outside the district, which can be very helpful sometimes.
Yeah, and I do want to point out, when you're speaking to behavior specialists, functional behavior assessments do not always have to be conducted by, I think when people hear that term, they think of like a BCBA or certain certifications. It doesn't necessarily have to be that type of certification. I mean, it can be your trained staff. Sometimes districts have intervention specialists who are trained.
Or school psychologists.
Or school psychologists. But you are going to have to certainly look at who's trained to conduct it and needs to be conducted by somebody who is. And there are going to be scenarios where you may not want your intervention specialist or school psychologist to complete this. You do want to bring in maybe a consultant or a BCBA or somebody who does have heightened certifications in behavior because of the nuances of the conduct.
Like a fresh set of eyes, or somebody the parent maybe trusts more if there's trust issues.
Right. The other thing I wanted to point out too is even if you do have a child who is identified under IDEA and you haven't reached the point where you need to do a manifestation determination, if you're seeing repetitive and interfering behavior, not only are you obligated to address the behavior if it's an area of need, but you also need to look at, is it interfering with other academic services, other learning, and looking at the FBA and the BIP well before you get to a manifestation determination may certainly help you even reach that point. And really districts and teams need to be discussing that and acting in a proactive way, not just kind of taking a seat back and saying, oh, well, I have 10 free days, I don't have to do one yet, so I don't need to do anything to address this behavior.
Well, and I think proactive FBAs also help, one, with training of staff. The more they get them done, the more they're used to them. But then also it helps kind of keep a small behavior from becoming a large behavior as you're addressing them before they've escalated.
Right.
Lisa, can you just clarify to our audience the difference between an FBA and a BIP or a BIP?
Yeah, absolutely. So an FBA is your functional behavior analysis. So that's actually basically your evaluation component. It's where you're defining in very specific terms, in measurable terms, what the behavior and conduct is that you're looking at so that you can gather data and figure out what might be causing that behavior. Because you need to know what's causing it to be able to determine what interventions are most appropriate. And so those interventions are what are going to go into the behavior intervention plan, or the BIP that we're referring to.
So the BIP is behavior intervention
and we'll dive into a little bit of how to develop those and some key issues we see in that. But before we go too far with that, I do want to make sure we point out too that not just in response to discipline, FBA and BIPs too may be a part of your actual initial or reevaluation of a child with a disability, especially if you're looking at an area of like emotional disturbance. Often you really do want to have that component, especially if the emotional the emotional disturbance displays in a way that is externalizing behaviors, you're certainly going to want to collect that data through an FBA, through your evaluation process. So oftentimes we see those pieces missing. Sometimes we only see rating scales, and that won't necessarily give you the data piece that you need to really get at the core of what's causing behaviors. And I'm sure you can speak to this in application too.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of nailed it there, though.
Thanks.
But there is a consent portion to FBA if you want to.
Yeah, so definitely.
Yes, that's super important.
Consent is important, and FBA is something that you're going to need parental consent for, because it is an assessment. And so you should not ever be conducting an FBA without that written consent from the parent, and you should also document attempts to obtain that consent. So sometimes a parent will refuse consent, will say, no, I don't want another observation of my child. I definitely don't want somebody in the classroom watching him. For whatever reason, the parent will refuse to give consent, and the districts should definitely document that, because you want to have that in a prior written notice to the parent, because later on, if the parent says, oh, how terrible is this district didn't conduct an FBA, so then you can say, oh, well, we tried, but here's some documentation showing that we couldn't get consent.
Yeah, and definitely be cautious too to not get in the pitfall of, because parent won't give you consent, that you just do nothing.
Right.
I mean, if you're aware of things, especially from your prior evaluations or just the observable behavior that everybody on the team has already documented, you can still put in some interventions if you have information that leads you there. Have you seen that in application as far as what information the team can have that they can at least try some things?
Yeah, and we'll touch base on that a little bit later in the BIP and FBA itself, but just kind of giving them the information ahead of time, if you will, allows them to kind of develop those proactive strategies that maybe it's not even a behavioral intervention, it's a trying to take out the sensory input or we call it positive reinforcement. When you add a stimuli and you get something, so that's, maybe it's a treat or extra time or stuff like that, or also the negative reinforcement, which is misunderstood. I think that people generally think of like punishment, but it could be something else. It could be reducing the lights, putting a blue filter over. So you're reducing that stimuli to try to get, and so those are kind of coming in beforehand to try to remove that behavior ahead of time.
So they could be environmental things, they could be teaching strategies. It wouldn't necessarily end up in a behavior intervention plan at that point, since you don't have the FBA.
Correct.
But you can still try some different things to help support that student.
Now, so Lisa, an FBA is not always necessary, right?
Right. Well, not so much. So the FBA you need to conduct when you really need that information to figure out the core reason of the behavior, right, to develop your plan. The piece that I see districts get caught up on too is whether or not they actually need the behavior plan.
Okay.
Like, do we need a separate, especially for students with a disability, they have an IEP, do they need to have a separate behavior document? And the answer to that is not necessarily all the time. Do you need to have two separate documents? Now, if you have behavior identified as a need, you do need to address it.
Sure.
So that's going to be through one of those modes. It may be the behavior plan, or it may be
like a
through,
goal?
It could be a goal, it could be your specially designed instruction, and then your accommodations, but it is going to need to be documented somewhere.
I understand.
So it's paperwork-wise, it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. Well, it does have to be one or the other, but it doesn't have to be one of those specifically, if that makes sense. We also have some circuits out there that have expressed and supported that a parent can't just make a claim and say you didn't provide FAPE and didn't address my child's behavior concerns because you didn't have a formal BIP, when the IEP appropriately addresses the behavior, appropriately provides services and supports for it. So that will be defensible.
So a court does not necessarily require a BIP, a behavior intervention plan, for every child that has an emotional disturbance, for example, or other kind of disability, as long as the district is somehow addressing those behavior challenges in other ways. Is that right?
Right. And keep in mind too, no matter where you're documenting this, you still also need to monitor progress for it. So just because you might not have a specific behavior goal in the IEP, you are going to have probably strategies and a goal tied to the BIP, and you need to also be monitoring progress for that, revisiting that on a regular basis to determine if it's working, and documenting progress that way, almost as you would as if you did have an IEP goal and objectives and data collection.
Yeah, the whole point of these two working together is to reduce this problematic behavior and increase the
Behavior
socially
we
acceptable
want, yeah.
behavior. And if you can't prove that through documentation, what are you doing?
Right.
And also remember too, if you have a BIP, that doesn't mean you're not going to ever do an FBA again either, because you very well may find, okay, this plan isn't working, or because of the functional behavior assessment, we thought the child was trying to avoid these tasks, and here that doesn't appear to be the reason, so we need to go back and get more data and look at, okay, maybe there's another underlying reason for the conduct. So don't be afraid to revisit those too, and you should when appropriate. But let's dive in for our listeners into kind of the developmental issues that we see with these.
Yeah, so let's talk about what an FBA looks like and how to develop one, because we're just kind of discussing when we need it and why, and what does it actually look like? What does a functional behavior assessment look like? Well, first of all, the special education law does not define that term. There's no neat and clean definition. But typically, IEP teams are required to address the various situational, environmental, or behavioral circumstances that come up in individual cases. Right. So basically, the functional behavior assessment has to take a look at whatever is going on with that child that results in this behavior. And that could be, like John mentioned before, environmental stimuli, some kind of situational stimuli. Sometimes an FBA, a functional behavior assessment, will look at antecedents and behaviors and consequences as well. But it all has to be data-driven. Yes. It has to be based on not the team's feelings, not what the teacher feels in that moment about this child who may be very upsetting or annoying in his or her behavior. It has to be based strictly, it's a scientific document, it has to be based strictly on the data collected by the observer. And sometimes I know that we see some problematic FBAs. We have, sometimes a district is just kind of, by the time they're doing that FBA, they are just kind of done. They're frustrated, the teachers are frustrated, the team is annoyed, and they're just filling out this FBA document. Maybe they've pre-printed it from somewhere, and they're filling it out with like, well, why is the child doing this? Because he's a naughty little boy, So that's a silly example, but sometimes we do see FBAs that are less than rigorous in terms of their data collection quality.
Yeah, sometimes we just see the team coming together and kind of just documenting what they think. Like, here's my hypothesis, and almost like in one session writing an FBA and writing a BIP, and there was no actual assessment or data process. So be super cautious not to do that. Also, keep in mind too, an FBA, that data, it's going to be through observations, it might be through some rating scales or assessments. There are going to be multiple components of that. You're really not going to be able to sit at, say, like a manifestation determination meeting and say, okay, it's a manifestation, so let's get out our papers, fill in this form, and we have the answer.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really going to be initiating the process of collecting the data. Not that you ignore the data you already have, you're certainly going to incorporate that, but you're not going to be able to just reiterate that and not go through it as a process.
That's a really important point. We see some functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans that are perfunctory, that the team is just kind of filling out what they already have assumed, or they know, or they think they know about the child. And there's just, I'm just going to say this really bluntly, there's no point to that. There's no point to that because whatever you were doing is not working.
Right.
Whatever you were doing for that child isn't working. So don't just fill in the paper with the same. I don't want to be more frustrated about this than I'm not that frustrated about it. But I do see sometimes this problem in districts where people are just filling out this paperwork kind of perfunctorily and not meaningfully. It needs to be meaningful.
Right. It's a process. It's actually providing information you need, not just the matter of, okay, we filled out the paperwork, we're done here.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
John, in your practice and as an administrator, can you talk about some of the things you've seen in FBAs and BIPs that we should see and are really quality documents?
So the quality contents of the FBA, it's going to be, as Miriam mentioned, interviews, observations, data, but kind of to piggyback what you just went through, over time, it's not going to be one observation, because what if you went in there and it was little Johnny is having a bad day. But you're also going to want to have detailed data, including schedules of the day, information from home too, because if you're only looking at first period and thinking, man, he is a terror first period, and you know nothing else, your BIP is not going to take into account that he doesn't have breakfast. He's been up since 3 a.m., stuff like that. So that's why those interviews from home are also important, to see what they're bringing in. One of my favorite analogies, it's called a ghost. We all carry them with us, no one else can see them, but they're there bothering you.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so I always think of making sure districts and educators in general understand that these kids are bringing stuff with them. Because an FBA, and this is extremely watered down, but is going to look at pretty much the function will fall into either obtaining something or escaping something.
Sure.
It's definitely much more thorough than that, but very watered down into those two umbrellas. And then once you figure out the function, that's when the BIP comes into play. And you're going to be coming up with interventions. So if it is to escape something, why is he trying to escape? Is it 11:30 and he's starving?
Or just the work is hard. The work could be.
Or is the work hard? So the intervention is going to come from that. And so, maybe if we think the work is too hard, we're going to reduce the amount. So is there any reason he needs to do all 20 math problems, or can he do 10? It has actually been proven that math worksheets go from easy to middle to hard. So maybe he does 3 easy, 2 middle, 1 hard. That's still going to show that he's grasping the concept.
That's a good example.
And so the quality BIP is going to have, the interventions for that problematic behavior, but then also the, technically intervention, you're coming in, but more the reinforcement for those appropriate behaviors.
Yeah, and keep in mind too, before you can even get to those interventions and really even collect the data in the FBA, you really have to operationally define what the behavior is you're looking at. So many times I see teams just write kind of general conduct, and if you don't know what behavior you're really trying to target, you're not going to be able to get at the core of why it's happening.
That's a great point, and I just want to say that whenever I see that in a behavior intervention plan, a definition of a behavior, I know that I'm going to be looking at a quality document. I really do.
Yeah.
It's true.
So I think we've already hit on too that it really needs to focus, especially the behavior intervention plan, on replacement behaviors, positive. Oftentimes too, I see teams get stuck on, okay, we want to get rid of this bad behavior. Well, yeah, you do, but how can we also look at those goals and what skills do you want them to gain? Do you want them to use positive coping strategies? Okay, let's focus our goals on that versus just reducing the outbursts.
And these replacement intervention behaviors need to also be individualized.
Yes.
So Miriam's appropriate attention-seeking behavior should look different than your appropriate. And so those need to correlate to the individual students.
Right, and still keep in mind too, we've talked about in many episodes the Andrew F. Supreme Court decision about kind of the standard of what districts have to show for FAPE. That's going to apply here too. So it's still going to be what's appropriately ambitious in light of this child's circumstances. So you really have to know that to be able to get to a place of providing appropriate services, addressing appropriate goals, providing appropriate strategies.
Yeah, in other words, so if you have a child, for example, who yells out, calls out every few minutes, for that child, because of the severity of his challenges, maybe making progress is just going to look like calling out every hour instead of every few minutes. That is going to be an important consideration in developing your goals and your behavior intervention plan as well.
Yeah, and another thing I really want to make sure we hit on too is the implementation after you develop it. So we don't just write these behavior plans and then throw it in the cumulative file and say, okay, we're done, we're good, right? A failure to develop and then implement an appropriate behavior plan can also turn into a denial of FAPE. So we have to make sure those plans are then realistic and can be implemented, that the staff that are involved are trained.
That's important.
which isn't just going to mean just the intervention specialist is trained, just the behavior specialist. You're going to have to make sure you're considering who's that child's entire team. Do we need to train a PE teacher? Do we need to train somebody in the
lunch
or in the
monitor,
hallway monitor, or other staff,
Administration.
or the administration? Yeah,
I can't tell you how many times we'll have a parent who says, you know what, my child had a behavior intervention plan, but this hallway monitor didn't know about it, so when my child was behaving in this way, he was escalated, and that's why this whole crisis happened. And if only you had followed the behavior plan, none of this would have happened.
And often, they're right. That's a hard thing to defend. Yeah. And I'm sure you've seen this in application in programs too as an administrator.
Yeah, and part of my role was also as a district consultant. And so they'd bring us in and we'd train on how to follow behavior plans, implement them, and things like that. And it was great because they included everyone you just listed, the lunch, the specials, the paraprofessionals, the teachers, the gen ed teachers that weren't even probably going to interact, but just in case.
Sure.
But the administrator was left out.
Oh.
And so
Which, by the way, is the key person who, when that child gets in trouble, is issuing discipline.
Yes. Yeah. And so in this instance, this kid told a friend on the bus, I'm going home today. I got a new video game. I'm going to act up. I asked the kid if he said that, and he goes, yeah, I'm going home.
He wanted to play a video game. I get it.
Yeah. I can't blame him for that. But so made sure the staff knew, and the teachers were great. The paras were great. Everyone was great until he was in the lunchroom using profanity, and the principal came in and said, you're out. I was like, oh no, the principal was left out. And
right,
so
and there's your discipline decision, right? Right, and disciplined and almost reinforcing the negative behavior instead of...
He got to go home and play his video game.
That's a good story showing how everybody has to be on the same page.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So let's just touch on really quick the key issues, kind of the takeaways for our listeners. One thing I don't think we've mentioned quite yet is for those students who are not already identified under IDEA, when they do have FBAs and behavior plans in place, please do make sure you're, one, monitoring those at regular intervals like any other student, but that also you're looking at the level of services that are included in those behavior plans. Because if they are getting services that suggest it's basically specially designed instruction, you also kind of have a red flag for a child find issue too. So just have that on your radar.
Okay, so in other words, if sometimes school districts provide these behavior intervention plans to children who are not yet identified as having special education needs.
As you should, as a tiered intervention.
Yeah, and that's a good idea because you always want to be proactive. But at the same time, if you have a child that really needs a detailed and intense behavior plan to be able to function in the classroom, maybe your teams should start thinking about, should this child should we suspect a disability requiring an evaluation? That's a question that your team should consider if a child who is not yet identified needs a detailed behavior plan.
Right, right. And one of the key things we've mentioned numerous times, just making sure you're not rushing through this process, you're not just jotting down this on the form, that you're really going through an interactive assessment process. Having the appropriate people trained, and also, as we mentioned earlier too, making sure that you're bringing in experts when you need to. Maybe you don't have a BCBA on staff all the time, but because of this specific student's conduct, you really need to bring that person's expertise in. You really are obligated to do so when it rises to a level that you need that.
And a BCBA is board certified behavior analyst.
Yes. Yeah. So I think we've kind of hit on the key FBA pieces. One last thing to mention too is you may be asked to provide an independent education evaluation for an FBA if a parent disagrees with it. So do know that that is a potential because it is basically another assessment, just like your evaluation report.
And if you want to know more about IEEs or independent educational evaluations, please tune in next time because that will be the topic of our next episode. We will be talking about independent educational evaluations and all of the questions that school districts get when parents demand one. So in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us again today, John.
Thanks for having me back.
Thank you, and please rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Send us mail. We love fan mail. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening.